Nom 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 nom. Hey, don't be serious. Так. Don't why you not. Overweight. Понимаете, тоже серьезно, да? Да, понимаете. Так. Наверное, нет, ну наоборот, да. Is it so bad? Not so bad. Nah. Fresher. Консерваtoire. Почему нет? Не знаю, что-нибудь придумаем. Заочку платную что-нибудь. Работать, да. Через ап.
What is the best processor for music production? What do you need to look out for when choosing the right processor? In this video, I'll talk about the generation of processor, Intel versus AMD, the amount of cores, why a fast processor is so important, and much more. A 7 series processor of the latest generation with preferably as much cores as possible. As you may know, synthesizer plugins, reverb plugins, and analysis plugins will take up a big chunk of CPU power, so you need a pretty powerful plugins. As you may know, synthesizer plugins, reverb plugins, and analysis plugins will take up a big chunk of CPU power, so you need a pretty powerful processor. It's the most important thing for music production. The quicker the CPU, the more calculations it can do in a second without having any dropouts or that annoying message in logic. With CPUs, the number of gigahertz is important. Rule of thumb, the higher the better. Because we have limitations in the number of gigahertz a processor can produce, we increase the processing power by adding more cores. A core is effectively another processor in the same shell, that is working side by the other processors. So more cores is more speed. But with double the cores, you don't have double the speed. With 4 cores, you have a good basis for music production. Yay! There are roughly 5 types of CPUs, in order of processing power in the same generation, the first being the slowest and the last being the quickest. The 3 series, then the 5 series, and quicker are the 7 series. Some brands have even a more powerful 9 series and server-grade processors. Server-grade processors tend to have more cache memory, which makes them quicker. But the server processors are somewhat behind in development, sometimes 1 or more generations. Because every generation processor tends to be more optimized and thus quicker, it is yet to be seen if a server processor is indeed quick. But the server processors are somewhat behind in development, sometimes 1 or more generations. Somewhat behind in development, sometimes 1 or more generations. Because every generation processor tends to be more optimized and thus quicker, it is yet to be seen if a server processor is indeed quicker. Look up comparison graphs on the internet to compare computing power between the specific types of processors. And is the price increase worth the extra speed? Well, most of the time not. What is cache memory? Cache memory is also important for speed. Cache memory of a processor is the fastest memory there is. If a processor can find repeated tasks in the cache memory, it doesn't have to go to the slower RAM memory. In other words, the bigger the cache of a processor, the quicker the CPU. 10th gen, 11th gen, gen 19th gen, 20th gen processor. What should I choose? Gen 19th gen, 20th gen processor. What should 11th gen of a processor, the quicker the CPU. 10th gen, 11th gen, gen 19th gen, 20th gen processor. What should I choose? Well, I say choose the most recent processor, because it has less security issues or it's faster. And one thing, those turbo boost frequencies are more a marketing term than anything else. With turbo boost you can boost your frequency for a short amount of time, and that is useful for opening a website, for example, but not for music production. You don't take advantage of them. You ask a constant amount of computing power of your processor. AMD or Intel? Well, that's an excellent question. At the moment, AMD is king when it comes to speed. However, AMD makes an implementation of an Intel processor instruction set. But I have to say, the compatibility improved tremendously over the last few years. But I heard rumors of some MIDI controllers not working and some plugins not working. So I asked producers specifically which plugins and which MIDI controllers are not working, but I got no real answers. Thunderbolt on AMD is still a little bit problematic because it's Intel technology. So controllers are not working, but I got no real answers. Thunderbolt on AMD is still a little bit problematic because it's Intel technology. So I asked you in my community tab here on YouTube, did you experience compatibility problems if you have an AMD processor? 32% said yes, compatibility problems no said 68%. I also asked for examples in the comments, but I got no tangible examples, regretfully. Should you invest in a bigger processor or in more memory? Well, invest in a bigger processor, because a processor you can't exchange later, and you can with memory in most cases. And memory becomes cheaper down the line, so it makes more sense. But there is one catch. If you have an Apple computer, you can't exchange memory or add memory later. So in that case, then invest heavily in memory when you buy one. But what about how much memory you really need? Or if you want to buy a laptop, what should you look out for? Well, I compiled a playlist right here with all valuable information about the best computers and best laptops for music production. If you want to buy a computer or laptop, definitely check that one out.
here with Music Marketing TV. Today we're going to be looking at Pro MB and a technique you can use to add intro.
наоборот.
Apple Silicon. It looks amazing for your average Joe, and it does so also for the music producer. But is it? Should you buy one? And if not, should you buy an Intel Mac? You have a little bit of a dilemma when you want to buy a Mac now. First of all, the life cycle.
Что такое?
Of a typical Apple product is about 3 years. After 3 years, they stop updating the product. But for Apple Silicon, they announced that they will shorten that life cycle from 3 to 2 years. In other words, you're basically buying an old computer when you buy an Intel Mac. But when you buy an Apple Silicon Mac right now, then you have the problem of software support. There are no DAWs out there yet that support the new platform natively. Except, of course, Apple's Logic itself. FL Studio says it's working on an update, so does Native Instruments and Steinberg, for example, and a lot of others. So this is a temporary problem. And you might think, well, hey, Rosetta is the compatibility layer between native Intel apps and native M1 apps. Yeah, the problem is that Rosetta is meant to be a quick and dirty solution for a temporary problem. For example, Rosetta was never meant to do real-time computing like we do with a DAW or video editing software, for example. Rosetta might work, but yeah, it might also lead to some really weird and quirky errors, for example. And even if DAW software makers would be ready for the new platform and have software on the new platform, we have a whole ecosystem of plugins that are not. And also this can take a while, and probably a lot of plugins won't even get updates at all. The new Apple processors are a so-called system on a chip, SoC. This has a lot of advantages. For example, being energy efficient, that is number one. Number two is really fast, because everything is integrated on one chip. For example, efficiency when it comes to computing tasks like loading a shit ton of plugins in your DAW. Yeah, that's really beneficial for us as music producers. But this system on a chip has also really negative effects, long-term negative effects for us as music producers. For example, no storage expansion after the fact and no memory expansion after the fact. And you might type in the comments here, yeah, Apple had that for years. That's true, but that is not what we want as a professional user of our computers. Also, another downside is the repairability of your computer. Apple doesn't want you to touch their computer. Apple made that abundantly clear in that whole right to repair thing. Apple likes you to buy a new computer every single time. So what's my advice? I would say wait. This is a first generation product, and Apple has the tendency to drop support for the first generation products really quick. Look at the first generation Apple Watch and the first generation iPad. So when you're buying a first generation Apple product, you're basically a bona fide beta tester. Let others do the beta testing for you. Let others spend their money on a beta product. And if you jump in on the second or the third generation, Apple has some room for some extra optimizations that you can benefit from. And in the meantime, DAW software makers and DAW plugin makers had the time to play catch up. These startup problems will be gone in the second or third generation of this. Hello everyone, welcome back. Dom here, and on this video I'm going to tackle a question that keeps coming up all the time, and that's what computer do I use for music production? So I'm going to show you what I've been using until now, but I'm going to take this one step further and I'm going to compare what I'm using now with what might be the ultimate PC for music production right after this. So as I said, one of the questions that keep coming up, especially after my studio tour video where I showed the PC that I'm using, was, hey Dom, what computer are you using for your videos? What computer do you use for music production? And like I said on my studio tour video, the computer that I'm using is a PC from scan.co.uk. I've been building my systems with Scan for pretty much a decade now. I know about PCs. I used to build my own systems. I used to build them from scratch until one morning when I had to produce and compose a track for a National Geographic show, and I had a super tight deadline, and basically my computer just failed on me. It just wouldn't turn on, and I had to go out, source for parts, figure out what's wrong, and all these things. I simply didn't have the time to do this. Since then, I was like, I take no risk. I have to find a reliable company that can do this for me. I know that they're I take no risk. I have to find a reliable company that can do this for me. I know that their computers are going to be optimized for music, and scan.co.uk is that company. And that's not sponsored. I've been and scan.co.uk is that company. And that's not sponsored. I've been purchasing my computers from Scan with my hard-earned cash. That's one of the computers that I'm using right now behind me, and that's the computer that I used to make my YouTube videos as well. But one of the questions that kept coming up all the time was, hey Dom, do you recommend Intel CPUs or AMD, the new Ryzens? And my answer to this question up to this point was, I'm not sure. I'm using Intel right now, but I've heard very good things about AMD, but I haven't tried them. So I went to Scan and asked them, hey, is there going to be a big difference with the AMD versus Intel? And what they said was, hey Dom, how about we send you a PC with some killer specs and you can check it out yourself? And I was like, that sounds interesting. So my geeky side obviously wants to check this out. So today I received this PC. Scan is the kind sponsor of this video. I don't get to keep this PC, unfortunately. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to run some tests and compare it next to this Intel i9 PC that I have right now, a very popular choice amongst music producers. And we're going to see what kind of difference you should expect from a popular. Compare it next to this Intel i9 PC that I have right now, a very popular choice amongst music producers. And we're going to see what kind of. I'm going to run some tests and compare it next to this Intel i9 PC that I have right now, a very popular choice amongst music producers. And we're going to see what kind of difference you should expect from a 2-year-old i9 Intel CPU to a cutting-edge 16-core AMD CPU. I'm very interested to see the results myself, because last time I upgraded my previous PC after 5 years of usage, the bump in performance was around 20 to 30%. So it wasn't a massive bump. It was a considerable bump, but it wasn't massive. Obviously for this test I'm going to be using Cubase as my DAW. I'm going to make this as fair as possible and as streamlined as possible, so I'm going to use only stock plugins. But even if you're using a different DAW, I think the results will also be very interesting, so it will give you a ballpark on what to expect from these cutting-edge CPUs. So I'm really excited. I have no idea if we're going to get a 10, 20%, 30% or 50% of bump in performance. Let's find out. Before we begin, coffee. So worth it though. So, here are the PCs. This is my old PC from Scan. Like I said, paid it with my own money. Amazing. I'm so happy with it. Super silent, incredible computer. This is my daily driver. And this is the beast that the lovely people at Scan sent me to test out. As you can see, a little bit bigger, but very similar design. And I have to tell you, I'm not surprised by this, by the way, but it's dead quiet. Like literally, I have my lav mic next to it and it's dead quiet. Like you're probably hearing the fan from my monitor over there more than the actual computer. Check it out.
Меня кота засосало туда. Кстати, реально у меня же там гуська плавала. Он еще и пометить туда надо. Это просто легенда был, кот такой, да. Кот-легенда.
It's dead silent, and this is the reason why I choose to go for PCs made by Scan.
Да, ну просто его довел его просто жить. Ладно.
Because they're always super quiet, because sometimes I want to record vocals or instruments in this very room, and having a quiet computer
не рекомендую,
is
я
really...
понимаешь, не рекомендую. Животный мир, он как бы не, если ты не трогаешь животных и лишнего не ешь, то ты их уважаешь, считай. Ты их употребляешь только когда тебе надо. Ну, например, сигареты протестировать на них там. Потом такой, да не, нахер курить нехорошо. И такой, ладно, живите, типа там, да. Пускаешь их в джунгли, они там свою жизнь живут какую-то там, или они там живут. Да, приходят сюда попрошайничать, и они тебе мешают, ты в Нью-Йорке их отстреливаешь, а потом такой, дайте я вам что-нибудь, как-то жестоко это выглядит при детях прямо, да. Давайте как-нибудь самое что-нибудь с вами сделаем, там, кастрируем, еще что-нибудь сделаем, понимаешь. А еще лучше какую-нибудь отпугивалку, и еще лучше как-то, чтобы они сами как бы не делали каких-то вещей, то есть дезинфекция, вот в чем проблема-то, что, да, понимаешь. Ну, неважно, короче, что-нибудь придумал, да, чтобы лишнего, да, ну, понимаешь, короче. Ну, в принципе, можно и пирожковые тоже, почему нет. Я понял. Корейский ресторан открыли, в Нью-Йорке все нормально сразу стало. Мастерские шапки рядом открыли тоже. Вообще все хорошо. Ну как бы да, то есть с ними, что там, животные, у них своя жизнь. Их не вот, да. Вот и все, да. Я не знаю, что с ними делать, если это, да. Так у тебя все равно место свободное. У тебя дома все равно никого нету. Что ты? Ну смотри, вот у меня, например, никого нету, но у меня тут все нормально. То есть для женщины это, наверное, тяжело, потому что и социум нужен какой-то хотя бы такой, да. Ну неважно. Да. Где-то дурдом нужно сходить, ладно, поехали. Ну, к тому, что ты понимаешь, что это нормально. Нормальнее, чем. Нет? Ну ладно. Но я как бы не буду никогда это самое ввязываться, и платить за это я тоже не буду. И смотреть, и нюхать это, и смотреть, и как бы человеческими именами пытаться называть их, и что-то, да. То есть пусть все живут свою жизнь, и все, меня не касаются. Вот тараканы, смотри, вот они тараканы живут свою жизнь, я с ними не согласен, но они примерно так же и коты на самом деле. Просто да. Оно так вот Маугли прям, да, понимаешь. То есть это наоборот получается. То есть если ты их приручаешь, то да, ты их не уважаешь, ты получаешь против, да, понимаешь, да. Вот я про это тебе говорю, да, ты же мужик, понимаешь, допустим. Ну, чтобы они жили там, вот, ну, заповедник сделать, закроете их решеткой там.
Really important. The experience that I have with my laptop, for example, which is not a PC, is really dreadful. The fans spin like that. Not a problem with this. I can have like a super loaded project and they're still super quiet. Now, let's get on to the test. But before we get started, if you haven't subscribed to the channel already, please do now, now's the time, and leave a like if you enjoy this kind of videos. So I won't hide it, guys, the geek inside me is really excited to see the results that we're going to get with this comparison. So let me explain the test that I'm going to do today. We're going to see how many instances of a really heavy retroload patch and 2 plugins we can load on these machines. So I'm going to be using Cubase 11.0.1 as my DAW today, and I'm using Windows 10, which in my opinion is one of the most reliable operating systems when it comes to music production. Windows 7 was the previous operating system I had. I never tried Windows 8 for obvious reasons, but Windows 10 is really good. First of all, let me show you my setup. Let's go to Studio Setup. I'm using my AXR4U audio interface. Most of you will know that this is the interface that I'm using, and here are the settings on my audio system tab. So I have my input latency, output latency. I am using 64-bit float as my processing precision. I have multiprocessing on, and the Asia Guard is also on. I always keep Asia Guard on, and on pretty much any real-world scenario you would have it on, so I decided to keep it on. Now, my buffer size, I'm going to start with 32 samples, okay? And the interface is connected using USB 3.1 Gen 1. So, 32 samples, this is my latency, and I think we can get started. To be honest with you, I never use 32 samples as my buffer size. Most of the times I keep it at 128. This is a sweet spot for me. But let's press these guys out. So, let's open my channels. So what I have here, I have 4 audio channels playing with no plugins on them, and these are going to be our audio indication if we have dropouts, okay? Now, the real stress will come from these guys. So on every one of these channels, I have a multiband compressor loaded and a Revelation reverb loaded with a lot of tail. And each one of these instrument channels has a Retrolog 2 loaded. Now, this is a really stressful patch, if you can call it patch. I have a multi-oscillator with 8 voices, detune, and this is ×3, so really intensive. Polyphony is set to 10 so that we know that it won't go over 10 for each instance, and I think we can get started. I'm going to start with a moderate number, 22 channels, and I'm going to make sure that when I play it back, nothing is record enabled, because this might change the performance a little bit. So let's have a listen. Okay, plays it very comfortably. Let's stress it out a little bit. Let's duplicate these tracks and let's see how it performs now. Okay, still plays comfortably. Let's duplicate this once. By the way, this shows you how powerful these PCs are. This is a 2-year-old PC. Okay, 28. Let's add one more. Okay, 29, still going. Very good. 30. Ah. Okay, 30 channels. 30 channels, we get dropouts, okay? It cannot keep up. Let's play one more time just to make sure that it's not a coincidence. Okay, 30 channels. So for this computer, my old Intel i9, at 32 samples, we can have up to 29 channels playing with no hiccups. On the 30th channel, we have dropouts. But I want to take it one step further. I want to load it up so much so that it cannot play any audio at all, so that the CPU can really not keep up with it. Let's add 10 more tracks, okay? Shift J. Now we have 41 tracks. Let's see if it plays. Of course, we get dropouts. Still plays though. I want to choke it completely. Okay, still playing. Let's add some more. 48, still playing. I'm impressed. Okay. 49. 49 is the limit. With 49, it cannot play any sound. It won't even start playing back. It's completely choking at 49 channels. Very, very interesting. And if I open the task manager, you will see that, yeah, the CPU cores are completely maxed out. As you can see, Intel i9 9900. So these are my current specifications. As you can see, Intel Core i9 9900 CPU, 3.6 gigahertz, 64 GB of RAM. So that's the test for this machine. Let's see what happens with the other computer. Okay, so now let's try the AMD PC. Happens with the Hertz, 64 gigs of RAM. So that's the test for this machine. Let's see what happens with the other computer. Okay, so now let's try the AM setup. As you can see, pretty much the same situation. 64-bit float, multiprocessing on, and ASIO guard on. And my settings for my AXR4U are exactly the same. So 32 samples. Here are my 10 note chords in Retrolog. And obviously, we also have multiband compressor and revelation on every channel. So I'm going to start off where my current PC, the Intel one, started having some glitches, okay? After 30 channels. Let's have a listen. Okay, no problem. I was kind of expecting this. Let's add a few more. Let's have a listen. Now we have 39 channels loaded. Okay, no problem. You know what? Let's add 10 more. 49 channels. No problem. Obviously, I don't think I've mentioned this, but these retrologs actually play, right? So I've just turned them down so that we're not annoyed by it, but that's what they play. Okay, they play this thing. We don't need to hear that, so that's why I've turned them down in volume. Okay, let's add some more. Let's go to 54 channels. Okay, let's add 4 more. So now we are at 58 channels. Let's have a look.
Hey, что ты мне показываешь?
Introducing Speechula, the most natural sounding text-to-speech software on the market. Hey, I'm Joe.
Hey.